Hey guys, Coach Pop here. Thanks for joining me through the video cast. This is lesson 2.1. So, this is the first lesson for chapter 2 on ancient peoples. As I mentioned in class on Friday, this second chapter is unique in several regards. First of all, it covers the entire ancient period, which is the by far the longest period of human history. It's also unusual because it involves all three key concepts for this time period in 1 week. The color for this time period is orange, and so you're going to notice that everything, including this video, is in orange. But what we're focusing on today is the first of these two key concepts: human origins and migrations, and domestication and its consequences. So, what you are doing while you're watching this video, you're filling in the blanks on the outline. You'll notice part A is on the front, part B on the back, but you are also annotating. That means adding notes. If there is a question, you should answer the question out in the margins. There's a couple of things where I'm going to see if you're really paying attention, and you're going to have to put something out in the margin. If I define a term that you don't know, you should probably define it, even if that's not something to fill in the blank. So add notes as well as just filling in the blanks. Now, because this first lesson covers such a huge time period and its two key concepts, we're going to organize these around focus questions to help you sort of narrow your focus here. The first focus question is, where do humans come from? And perhaps more importantly, how do we think we know this? Well, our species, human beings, are what's known as Homo sapiens, which means the thinking man. We are bipedal primates. That is, we are part of this family of biology called primates, but we walk on 2 feet. There's other species that have inhabited the earth that have done this, but the earliest versions of our species that we have evidence of come from about 250,000 years ago. That's a long time. This is the earliest we have evidence, though, that humans were on the earth. And as I pointed out in class last week, the history of the planet Earth is millions and millions and millions and millions of years, and the history of the universe is billions and billions and billions of years. So if you look at it from that perspective, that's a relatively small amount of time, but that's a long time when you're considering human history. But a question that David Christian in particular raises: what is it that makes us unique? Human beings are, in fact, different from other species on this planet. Why? Well, for him, the answer is we have this thing called collective learning. It's not really just that we have language, which we do, but we have symbolic language. That is different from other species, both in terms of our speech, but also in terms of our writing. The effect of that, why he calls it collective learning, collective knowledge, is it can be passed down from generation to generation to generation. And so there's a cumulative effect of information that happens for our species that does not seem to um, occur for other species. Why does any of this matter? Well, because we need to understand our species to understand the question, where do we come from? Now, the best evidence currently suggests that we come from Africa. This is something known as the out of Africa hypothesis. It basically states that our species, Homo sapiens, started in Africa and then emigrated out to go to the rest of the world. Okay, what's the evidence for this? Well, there's three basic types of evidence. The first of these is fossilized skeletons. The earliest fossilized skeletons of Homo sapiens by far appear in Africa. Way, like we're talking about tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years earlier than other places throughout the world. A second type of evidence is stone tools. Now, there are other species who have made tools. Ours are a particular type, and they have obviously survived because they're made of stone. The earliest of those also appear in Africa, and again, by a wide margin compared to the stone tools that Homo sapiens made that we have for other parts of the world. The most recent form of evidence, though, comes in the form of DNA. And this is from a project that was started several decades ago, the Human Genome Project, and it discovered something rather startling. All human beings who are not African or of African descent have a common ancestor. In other words, DNA proves that all people who are not black came from that group that emigrated out of Africa about 100,000 years ago. Again, that was a pretty remarkable finding. It also explains the image that I showed you on Friday, why it is that the people that maybe look more similar in group B, who all come from Africa, actually have more genetic diversity, because that genetic diversity happens over 250,000 years. The people in group A, who while physically they may look much more different, they've all evolved in whatever ways they have genetically in the last 100,000 years, and so there's less room for genetic variation. This is a really crucial quotation from an anthropologist whom I actually studied when I was in college. That was way, way back. But in 2001, he made this quote. And there's two parts of it that I want you to notice. First, notice the parts that I've underlined there: anatomical, archaeological, and genetic evidence. That refers back to the three types of evidence that I just talked about. Anatomical, having to do with the fossilized skeletons; archaeological, with the stone tools; genetic, meaning DNA. The second thing to note, though, is in the second sentence. The out of Africa hypothesis is currently the best theory we have to explain the evidence available to date. And this is a crucial point I want to make here. The way science works is if you get new evidence, you're going to have to reevaluate your hypotheses. Now, this quotation in 2001, every piece of evidence that's been uncovered since in the last 21 years has confirmed this hypothesis. But if we get evidence that forces us to change it, we're going to have to change it. In other words, it seems, based on the available evidence, that human beings come from Africa. However, that is subject to change if we get evidence to the contrary. Now, this is an image that you're going to see again. I'm just giving you a heads up that sort of describes this human uh, migration out of Africa. And there's a couple of things that I want you to notice. You should look carefully at where they go and when. However, you don't need to know the specific dates when they get to different parts of the world. What you do need to know is the order of the continents. Humans originated in Africa, we think, and then about 100,000 years ago migrated into the Arabian Peninsula. So the order of the continents humans reached is what you need to know, not the dates, okay? So they start in Africa. The first place they go about 100,000 years ago is, in fact, Asia. The Arabian Peninsula is part of Asia. The next place they go, if you follow along, they're cruising along the southern coast of Asia. They eventually make it to Australia about 60,000 years ago. That's 20,000 years before they make it to Europe. And that's pretty remarkable when you stop and think about it. Human beings got to Australia well before they got to Europe. Then some of those humans who had migrated north into what's now Siberia will cross into North America and then eventually South America, in other words, the Americas. That's sort of the last that you need to know. There's a dotted line there, by the way. There's evidence that there was an earlier route that was coastal, people moving in what would basically be an early form of a canoe. The problem is that most of the evidence that supports that is probably underwater and really hard to reach if it exists at all anymore. There is a tantalizing bit, though, that humans got to North America earlier than we think they do currently. Here's what I would like you to do, though. Out in the margin, simply list the order of where humans got, not the dates, the order. Started in Africa, then Asia, then Australia, then Europe, then the Americas. However, you will also notice if you look closely at this map, there's something weird going on in the Pacific Ocean. Human beings make it to all those islands in the Pacific, but look at those dates. Those are very recent relative to the dates of every place else. And this is something that is called the Polynesian migrations that we'll look at much later on. But look at, we're talking about tens of thousands of years later than every place else. And that has a consequence because that is well after the Neolithic revolution. And so domesticated plants and animals are part of the adventure that humans are making in the Pacific Islands. So we're going to leave that out for now, except to understand that is way later than the other places on the planet that they got. So now let's turn our attention to the second focus question. Why do humans migrate? Okay, humans migrated out of Africa. Why? What makes us move anyways? Some of you, if you had human geography last year, might remember some of this. If not, it's okay. But there's basically a combination of two factors, what we call push factors and pull factors. Push factors are negative conditions that are basically pushing people away from where they are. There's something happening that they have to get out. Pull factors, on the other hand, there's something positive or beneficial that is pulling people towards some new location. Now, what I would like for you to do is hit pause in just a moment and list at least three examples that you could think of push factors, negative conditions that would force people to leave their home, and then list three examples off the top of your head of pull factors. In other words, positive conditions that would draw them. Please hit pause and just come up with three of each off the top of your head. I hope that you did that. But next you'll notice there's this term emigration with an E that it asks you to define. Here's the definition you want to write down. Emigration is the act of leaving your old home. Immigration, on the other hand, notice I am. English is a weird language. Someday I'm going to have to prove to you how weird it is. Immigration is the act of entering your new home. So migration is sort of this general term meaning movement. Emigration, when you're talking about the people and what they're leaving behind, immigration meaning what the people are coming into. But there's another term that we're going to use called refugee. And refugees are kind of in an unusual situation because they have no home. They have to get out, but they're not going to a particular place. They're stuck literally in this kind of no man's land. And this is a phenomenon that happens repeatedly throughout human history. In this image, I want to draw your attention to what it says in the caption there. There's more people living in the red area than in the blue area. Okay, so what? Well, here's the so what. Perhaps in your lifetime, but most likely in your children's lifetime, that area in red is going to be underwater. If that happens, we're going to see a refugee crisis that the human species hasn't seen before. If there's more people living in the red and all of those people become refugees, where are they going to go? And how is that going to be managed? This is why that is an important question to consider. Now, if you will turn your sheet over, 2.1.b involves the third focus question. How and why did humans begin domesticating plants and animals? And what we'll look at more closely in an activity in class on Monday, what were the consequences? Like, how did this really change things? Now, in order to try to answer this question of how and why humans started domesticating, we're going to look at it chronologically, okay? So we're going in chronological order here, beginning with the Paleolithic. Paleo means old, lithic meaning Stone Age. This is by far the longest period of human history, from 250,000 years ago up to around 14,000 years ago. By the way, if you would hit pause, convert that to a date. What was the date around 14,000 years ago? Just show me that you got the hang of this. But here's the point. 100% of the people who lived in the Paleolithic era were foragers. They hunted for their food and gathered their food. They hunted wild animals and they gathered wild plants. How do we know that 100% of them did that? Because domestication wasn't invented yet. It wasn't a thing. Moreover, as we've seen, the earliest humans who migrated out of Africa were all foragers. The humans that got to everywhere were foraging. The exception to that is, as I pointed out, the Pacific Islands, because that happens so much later. They actually do bring domesticated plants and animals. Again, we'll talk about that more. Now, there's a turning point that some historians don't recognize, and it has to do with what region of the world you're looking at. But there is something called the Mesolithic, Middle Mesolithic Stone Age. This is a period between about 14,000 and 10,000 years ago. Here's what's going on. There is a dramatic change in the climate of the planet at the time during the Mesolithic period. The last ice age has ended. Okay? So, like, the world as a whole is getting warmer and wetter. All of that water that was locked up in ice is melting, and it's creating these huge river valleys throughout the world. As a consequence, there's simply more natural wild food. Again, foragers are hunting and gathering, but there's more wild animals and more wild plants for them to be able to hunt and gather for their food. That leads to a term that David Christian actually coined, affluent foragers. They're still foragers, but we tend to think of affluence as wealth. Foragers, as we'll see, don't have any personal property, but there's so much abundant food, they don't really have to work so hard for it anymore. So we call them affluent foragers. They're still foragers, but it's pretty good time to be a forager in the world. Among these affluent foragers are a group of people we call the Natufians. And the Natufians lived in the area of the Levant. This is a term that'll come up repeatedly. It's already come up once. So, like, this is the Mediterranean here. Here's the Nile. Here's Egypt, Cyprus. Here's Turkey. So, the Levant is the east coast of the Mediterranean basin. And in this area, there are these people, affluent foragers called the Natufians, living in the Levant around 12,000 years ago. Now, here's what's interesting. They become semi-sedentary. Sedentary is a term we're going to talk about a lot. They're still foragers, but there's such an abundance of food that there's certain places that they can always come back to at a certain time of year and know that there's going to be food there. And so they set up these structures while they're not living there. They know they're always going to come back over and over. as a consequence, a sort of common culture starts to occur. In this particular image, in that grayish color, all the people living there have a similar culture because they're all semi-sedentary. They've got these structures they come back to at certain points of the year instead of constantly moving in random directions chasing their food. As a consequence of that increased food, even though they're still foraging for it, their populations start to grow. Again, the Natufians are just a sort of example of the people living in the Mesolithic era. However, the bigger turning point happens in the Neolithic age, the New Stone Age, Neolithic Stone Age. This is from about 10,000 years ago, and it goes to various points, as we'll see in just a moment, depending on what part of the world you're talking about. Please note, these are all processes that don't happen overnight. They're not points on a map, they're ballparks. Climate change, though, is a crucial factor helping us understand why humans started domesticating plants and animals in the first place. So, around 10,000 years ago, the last ice age is in its death throes. It's like it's over, but there's this last final push. If you've ever seen a Shakespeare play, all Shakespeare's play, like people are dying, and then all of a sudden they rally and they have this freaking long speech that they go on in this soliloquy, right? That's a death throw. Well, the last ice age, it's dying, but all of a sudden things get colder and drier. It's like this Hail Mary for the ice age. That leads to a drought, a global drought that lasts for about 1,000 years. That's a long time. The issue is this, though. The human population grew because there was an abundance of plants and animals that they could hunt and gather. Now you've got more people, and getting food is harder. Humans are going to have to do something different. There's more humans, they can't sustain themselves. Domestication begins. They start domesticating certain plants and certain animals out of necessity during this 1,000-year drought. That requires some new stone technologies, hence the term New Stone Age. Stone tools, instead of being used for hunting and gathering, are now used for farming. For example, certain blades that might have been used for like scraping hides, while they might still be used for that, are now altered as scythes. In other words, they can take the kernels of these wild plants off of the top of the plants. Hoes are another one. If you don't know, a hoe is basically a wooden stick with this thing on the end that you use. You could use it to, plow in furrows, but you could also use it to take the weeds out. All of a sudden, they're making them out of stone. That was not a thing before. And later on, plows. They realized, well, I could take a bigger version of that, hook it up to some animal, and just make even bigger furrows to plant even more food. This then leads to two new life ways. So we've gone from foragers to affluent foragers. In the Neolithic era, we get sedentary farmers, people who are no longer moving at all. They're planting the same crops every season, getting most of their benefit from those crops. In some places, though, they can't grow those crops. They can, however, domesticate animals, but those animals need to eat grass. And so they have to be constantly moving to find new grass. These are what we call pastoral nomads. They're moving, but they're moving in a given territory to get their herds to more grass. Some places, you might recall from reading Jared Diamond last year, some places have the perfect combination of both those plants and animals. Here is a very interesting map. We probably won't get much time to go into much detail before, but what you see here is throughout the world during the Neolithic Revolution, plants and animals are domesticated out of necessity. Please note, though, they happen in different regions independently. It is not the case that domestication happened in the Fertile Crescent and then spread to the rest of the world. It happened in different areas at different time, and then it spread out from all of those. The second thing to notice on this map in orange, the places where they couldn't domesticate plants because they simply wouldn't grow. They could, however, domesticate animals. That's where the pastoral nomads would develop. Through a process of migration and diffusion, which we'll get into more later on in class, those technologies, if you will, but life ways, as David Christian calls them, begin to spread. Look carefully at this image. Along the left is population. That's on the whole planet in millions of people. So this is 10 million people on the whole planet. Here is time. Please notice as well, it's not distributed equally, but you get the idea there. Okay? So here's what I want you to notice. About 10,000 BCE, which would be about 1,200 or 12,000 years ago, that's when the affluent foragers are benefiting from the warmer and wetting climate, and notice the population goes up. Then around 8,000 BCE, which is around 10,000 years ago, look at the population on the planet. It sort of levels out at 5 million. One of the questions we're going to get into in class is what the heck is going on there? Nonetheless, if you look, starting around 4000 BCE, the human population is going to take off as a result of domestication. Demographics is a word that we use to describe changes in human populations, okay? Now I'm going to give you a couple of images here, and then you're going to have to pause and sort of summarize them in your own words. The first, there is a positive feedback loop from domestication and its effect on demographics. Here's how this works. You start here where it says start. You figure out how to make plants and animals into reliable food sources. In other words, you increase agricultural productivity. That leads to more people. Now you have more people who can go out and manage the plants and animals, which leads to even more people, which leads to more food, which leads to more people, and so on. That is a positive feedback loop. Hit pause and then summarize that in your own words. Now, in addition to a positive feedback loop, we also have a negative feedback loop, but this one is much more complex. Again, you start where it says start, but here's the thing. Over time, that farming and grazing is going to lead to environmental degradation. It's not a question of if, it's when. When that happens, you're going to have consequences like food shortages, like diseases, like social conflict. You got people that don't have enough to eat, you will have social conflict. People don't like it when they are starving to death. Those, in turn, are going to lead to one of two consequences. Either you're going to come up with an innovation, a new way to increase your food production. If you do, you got more food, you're going to have more people, everything's cool. But again, at some point, you're going to have now you're back where you started. Or once you get here, you simply can't do it. Like you can't come up with a solution. In that case, your human community is done for. you can no longer sustain that particular way of life. Hit pause, take a moment, in your own words, define what a negative feedback loop is. Okay, this is kind of a long video. I apologize, but let's wrap this up here. The Stone Age ends sometime after around 5000 BC, although it happens at different times in different parts of the world. But why? Well, there's two big factors. The first is technological. The Stone Age, anything ending in lithic, ends when metals start to be used for tools and weapons. Now, this requires, if you remember that image from Jared Diamond last week, you have to have food surpluses in order to have job specialization. In other words, people have to be free to spend their whole days thinking about, how can I do this? That leads to technological innovation. The first of these is copper. Copper it looks green. It's this really obvious sort of thing that's found in rocks. It sort of looks like veins. Somebody figured out that if you can make a fire hot enough, now you're just not burning a campfire here, you got to have some sort of stove, you can melt that and then turn that into a tool or a weapon. That's the first use of metals that we find. But then we get bronze. Somebody figured out, if you take that melted copper and you add melted tin to it, it creates bronze, which is much harder and holds an edge much better than copper. Copper is really cool, but it bends very easily. Bronze is much harder. So this is a huge leap forward. Eventually, we're going to get iron. This takes a really freaking hot fire, and you're basically melting the iron ore out of the rocks. But it's way harder, way more durable than bronze is. So that becomes like the bigger step in the making of tools. Steel, by the way, is a form of iron, but we'll get into this more later on. That's where you manipulate the amount of carbon that's in the iron. So that's not something we're going to get into yet. So the first way the Stone Age ends is when stone tools and weapons are replaced by metal ones. But right at about the same time in different parts of the world, we start to get the world's first civilizations. This is where we're going to pick it up, not just in the next lesson, but also later activities throughout class. So the next activity we do in class is looking at what are the effects of this transition as we go from the Stone Age into these early parts of the world. So again, to review our three focus questions. Now, by the way, for this, you should simply be able to answer them. After we get out of Unit 1, you'll see the focus questions in your, like, what you do for the homework lessons. Instead of getting a stamp, you submit them on Schoology. That's coming up later. For now, where do we come from and how do we know that? We come from Africa. Homo sapiens originated in Africa, and we know that primarily through three types of evidence: fossilized skeletons, stone tools, and DNA. Why do humans migrate? It's almost always a combination of push factors forcing them out and pull factors forcing them in someplace else. Refugees, however, are in that unique situation. They got to get out even though they have nowhere to go. And finally, how and why did humans begin domesticating plants and animals? Because of climate change. Affluent foragers in the Mesolithic period had increasing populations, but the change in climate made it easy to find food. Then when there's a 1,000-year drought at the beginning of the Neolithic period, they're forced to adapt. And the way they adapt is by slowly manipulating plants and animals to benefit humans, so that now the plants and animals serve humans for their food requirements instead of humans having to constantly go out and search for them. The consequences, again, is the point of the activity that we're doing in class. If you stuck with me this long, guys, I really want to thank you. I try to keep all of the homework lessons a half hour or less. This one went slightly over, but I really appreciate your attention. Make sure you got your outline filled in, annotate, bring it in to get it stamped on Monday. If not, not the end of the world. Just make sure you get it done in time for Wednesday. Look forward to seeing you in class. Thanks again, guys.